Fight.
Welcome back to the 2-Pointers podcast. I'm Trevor Everett. Today, before we jump into the interview with Noa Dalzell, first of all, thank you to Noah for the time talking to me about the Boston Celtics and just what that team has looked like this year in dominating fashion. As we recorded on Monday, January 15th, so a couple days before this pod goes out. It'll be out on the 17th on Wednesday. Boston Celtics were 30-9 coming into this podcast. So really, really great stuff from her. She's around the team most every single day, covering for Celtics blog or SB Nation. So really, really great time there. Just wanted to not add any extra segment or time into this. Even if you're not a Celtics fan, I think you'll get a lot of really good information out of this podcast. She's, again, really great at what she does covering the team. Wanted to intro some stuff at the top. Like I said, didn't want to add any long segment to make this podcast even longer. The last one with Paul and Ian from the Greenlight podcast ended up being almost an hour and a half. So I wanted to spare you guys that extra, sit through, I guess, basically, right? I think we went close to 40 minutes with Noah. So just wanted an intro at the top here just to talk about that. Let everybody know where they can find that stuff, etc. So don't forget, SeatGeek.com is the presenting sponsor of the 2-Pointers podcast. You can get $20 off your first purchase, concerts, sporting events, basketball games, as always, of course. No matter what you're getting the ticket for, SeatGeek in the app and online, we'll show you a deal score that is on a scale of 1 to 10, red being bad, of course, yellow being fine, and green being the best, based on that 10 out of 10 and green deal score. You'll know that you're getting a really good value for your ticket. I'll also have a chance there for you. You can save $20 off your first purchase. Code 2-Pointers, TWOPOINTERS. That's code 2-Pointers will get you $20 off your first purchase. SeatGeek.com, link in the top of the description. Without further ado, thank you again to Noah, and enjoy the interview. All right. As you heard at the intro at the top, we are joined today by Noa Dalzell, NBA writer for the Boston Celtics for SB Nation, Celtics blog. That's at Celtics blog on X or Twitter, whatever people call it nowadays. Connecticut Sun beat for the Next Hoop and Swish Appeal. First of all, thank you for the time today. MLK Day, we got some great stuff with basketball this week. We'll get into some of the stuff for the Celtics specifically. But first of all, let people know where they can find your work and a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And you can find my work on, I would say probably X or Twitter is the best place, Noa Dalzell NBA. And I primarily cover the Boston Celtics for Celtics blog, as you mentioned. And then this season, I will also be covering the Connecticut Sun. So kind of hoping to expand coverage there. Mostly just have been following the team my whole life, but this is my first year actually covering the team for SB Nation.
So I want to jump right into something that people may not know about you that you said we kind of talked before we recorded this, that, you get asked about this and you send it to this guy. And I think it's a fascinating part of just the thought process around what you may be doing. So for people that don't know, your dad was an incredible player. I have some stuff in the background here, and you correct me on any of this. Israeli Basketball Premier League for 14 years, 83 to 97. That's 1983 to 1997. Career high of 42 points, number 3 all time in 3-point shooting. And then the part that I found really fascinating was 2008 was inducted into the Israeli Basketball Hall of Fame. Like, anytime you put the tag Hall of Fame behind it, no matter what people think about the Hall of Fames at every level, right? The Basketball Hall of Fame being kind of the one that gets looked at the most loosely, right? Any Hall of Fame, whether it's a Ring of Honor for a team, like, that's an honor in any way. You posted a video recently, and Wikipedia backs up what you said in the tweet. I don't know if you have it in front of you, but I will tell you this. This is what Wikipedia says, and I want you to correct this if it's right, if it's wrong. At age 63, he still plays in several leagues, and most recently averages 30 points per game in a recreational basketball league. So I guess my question is, does he upload his own Wikipedia page? Because that's really fun and very unique and detailed there. I like how that leads into him.
That's a great question. I do wonder who's the latest person to update his Wikipedia page. I haven't checked it out in a while, but I can confirm that he does. Yeah, he's been playing with me for the last couple of years on a co-ed basketball team that I play with some of my roommates and friends. And then, he's on it as well. And not only is he on it, but he's actually been kind of by far, I would say, our leading scorer, like almost to the point that now that he's injured, we cannot figure out how to score in these games. And so, like you said, he played professional basketball in Israel for a really long time. Before that, he played at Eastern New Mexico. And then yeah, his thing is 3-point shooting. So I don't like I watch every NBA warm up. I watch the Celtics warm up every day. I've never seen anybody shoot like him, truly. And so that is, I wish I had inherited it a little bit better, but I definitely inherited the passion. So that's kind of why I'm here today.
Right. I think the passion's a great point. So talk about like how big was his playing career being around the game a lot? Because I know you hear about that with former players and like, like Steph Curry is the famous example, right? Being around dad and all that stuff, right? But like how big of an influence was he and his career on what you do now and how big of a passion it is?
Yeah, so I didn't ever get to I wasn't alive when he was playing professionally, so I wasn't like one of those kids that was hanging around at that point. I kind of wish I had. I think it would have been a fun couple of years as a youth. But I did, my whole life watch him play in rec leagues where he was 20, 25, 30 years older than everybody else on the court. And so that was always fun. I was always kind of like, I don't think I realized until more recently how wild that was. But I knew I wasn't a very athletic or kind of sports oriented person growing up until I remember one day I went to the park with my dad and he taught me how to shoot, and I was shooting layups and underhand free throws and kind of anything I could to try to get the ball to hit near the basket. And then I think a week later I became officially like addicted and obsessed with the sport in every facet and watching the NBA, playing myself, reading everything I could, watching YouTube videos. That was when I was in middle school, and I don't think I ever would have stumbled into it otherwise. And then he coached my AAU team all through high school. And so not only did he kind of teach me independently, but also he, myself, my best friends, he coached all of us. We all loved him as a coach. And now a lot of us are teammates together. So that's been really fun to kind of transition into adulthood like that. And then, yeah, it's just been it's been a blessing to kind of learn the sport and learn the game from him because he really understands it to a very deep level. So a lot of times even when I'm covering the game live, if the Celtics are away and I didn't travel with the team, then I'll maybe watch the game with him and he'll point stuff out to me and he'll show me kind of different things that he sees on the court. So even today, it's really fun to have his kind of brain and understanding of the game with me whenever we're kind of talking about the Celtics, talking about other NBA teams and their schemes and things like that.
I love it. I always like to, this is our first time doing a podcast together. I always like to get people's inspiration behind, not necessarily what they do, but just where the root of what they cover comes from, if there's a certain passion there. And I think that really ties into well. And of course, you posted the video not that long ago. People can check that out. Links for everything like that will be below as well. All right, so I don't want to bore the listeners with stats, but I'll tell you the truth. I've seen the Celtics enough this year. What my eyes see and then what the stats say, most of the time they start to add up once we have a sample size, right? 39 games, if I got it right so far, right? 39. So here's what I want to lay out. I don't want to bore you or the listeners with stats, but I do want to point some things out that are interesting that will help form this question that I think you've, again, seen plenty of times being around the team this year. So no Celtic individually is in the top 5 of any major statistical category that's shown on NBA.com stat page. So for those who don't know that, points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals, field goal percentage, three-pointers made, and three-point percentage, and then fantasy points per game is thrown in there because NBA.com wants you to play fantasy, of course. But the point is that I think that speaks to a couple of things that we'll get into today about where this team is. And here's some team stats to kind of lay into this a little bit. On the NBA.com stat page, 5th in points per game, 1st in rebounds per game, tied for first with the Thunder with 6.4 blocks per game, and then 1st in three-pointers made. And then you start digging into some other ones I won't go into now. 1st in net rating in super detail. But knowing that and why I led that into it is obviously, this is a really, really strong team in a lot of different facets. What do you think has been the biggest difference maker to where this team's success is through 40 games, we'll call it?
Yeah. So you have buy-in from the best guys, and really, like, genuinely, I believe that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown and the rest of the starting 5, but then also the bench players have accepted what their role is going to be on this team, and they're not overly concerned with individual accolades. They're not concerned with Tatum could be saying I'm 25 years old. This is my year to win MVP. I think it's actually kind of an open field, so he could be viewing it like that. And let me see if I can average 35 points per game. And then if he was averaging 35 points per game, he'd probably be the front runner right now. And so I think you have complete buy-in from all of those guys that they're going to play team basketball and that they're not going to worry about their own statistics and their own individual success. And part of it is just their age. Though Tatum and Brown are still young, they're not 21, 22. And I think back, following the team a couple of years ago, I don't know if they had that level of maturity yet where they were ready to sacrifice those types of individual accomplishments just for the team's betterment. And then you have a very unique and defensively gifted backcourt in Derek White and Drew Holiday. Two guys that are willing to serve as whatever role that needs to be played on this team. They're willing to, kind of be spot shooters. They're willing to guard the best defenders on the other team. They don't need to have plays called for them. They're not worried about if they get 5 shots one night and 20 shots another night. And so you have this kind of balance of guys that are just really bought into the system and really bought into this goal of winning a championship. And I think you're seeing that reflected in the team success. And you're also seeing, like, it doesn't surprise me at all. I didn't know that statistic of, none of them are in any of the categories as top 5, but it doesn't surprise me at all because that very much has been kind of the philosophy of this team this year. And it's a luxury too, because they obviously have enough talent that no one guy has to go out there and dominate like other teams, might have that situation. But it's definitely like absolute buy-in is what I would say.
I love that. That actually ties into a question I had later on, so I'll just jump right into that because I think it speaks perfectly to what I've seen. So you've been around the team a lot, right? Here's what I kind of noticed that, first of all, this stat stuck out to me, or this thing stuck out to me. So Brown and Tatum are the last 2 guys left from the bubble playoffs, which wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. I know it's been, I guess technically it would have been 4 seasons ago if I'm doing the math right, because he had the shortened one running and, getting into the bubble, and then the 3 following there. But, when you think of the continuity of teams, regardless of what this current era of the NBA feels like, where there's a lot of movement and changing, right, to have 2 guys only from 4 years ago, right, to not have anybody long-standing beyond that as a veteran, Kemba, some I'm just notable names that have left since then. Kemba, Marcus Smart, Carson Edwards was on that team, Gordon Hayward, Semi Ojeleye, Grant Williams, Enes Kanter, Kanter at the time, I'm allowed to say that, Tice Williams, Taco Fall, guys like that, right, that were around that team. What, like, I'm trying to figure out the way to cohesively give this thought, but what do you feel like, you mentioned the buy-in, right? Like, what can you speak to, I guess this is a question more of like, what can you speak to being around the team about the cohesion and the chemistry? You kind of already alluded to it in the previous, question and answer, but, talk, I guess, more in detail about what that looks like, because, again, to have 2 guys only that have been there for X amount of years, right, to have a lot of guys that are newer, what have you seen that has helped make that impactful?
Yeah, so part of it, I would say, is Al Horford. And he's a guy that he wasn't on that group, but he was previously with the Celtics and then left and came back. And we would like to pretend like he never left and he's just been here the whole time. I think that's kind of the understanding from the fan base. But Al is someone who, everybody has praised them for being the guy that comes off the bench this year. He was a starter in the last couple of years, and now he's the 6th man. And I think it was pretty obvious that he was going to be the 6th man once the roster took form. But he's the veteran. He's 37 years old. He's been every single time I interview a player about who's taken him under their wing. Even a guy like, I just spoke to a new 2-way player, Drew Peterson, that they signed. And I asked him, who has reached out to you, who's taking you under their wing? Al Horford. It's no matter what the circumstances, he's the guy that's kind of mentoring everybody, kind of like a father figure on this team. And so I think that kind of trickles down to everybody else. And so while there isn't, a lot of those guys are gone from the bubble year and, that roster is really reshaped, I think he's been a really important part of this, and part of why I don't think that they would trade him for, a high value young player, because he has that really important kind of locker room role. And then I think Drew Holiday too is someone who, he's an NBA vet. He's won a championship. He's been an all-star multiple times. He comes in, he could be upset at the fact that now he has a much more limited role. He got traded. He wanted to retire in Milwaukee. And you see none of that. You see that he's completely bought in from the get-go. He's all about making his teammates better, taking on tough defensive assignments. And so those 2 guys, as older players on this team, I think have kind of set the mold for everybody else. But like I said, I do think, Jalen and Jason are the 2 that, have the most, have the largest ability to maybe be selfish, not because of who they are, but just because of how talented they are and how they could be kind of gunning for those personal accolades. And I think the fact that they're willing to kind of not be overly concerned, it trickles down to everybody else. And the last thing I'll say is we oftentimes, I think, as when we talk about, roster composition and NBA teams, sometimes guys like 9 through 15 are forgotten and overlooked. And that's because they're not on the court. They're not putting up big numbers. But this group, and I genuinely believe this group has a very unique number 9 through 15. In the sense that they're all happy to be there. They're not concerned about their minutes. They're not concerned about their individual production. You don't see guys that are like worried about, their contracts this summer, things like that. Every single time, I talked to Lamar Stevens a couple weeks ago. He was saying that even though last year he was a starter on the Cavs for much of the season, this year he really hasn't even been in the rotation. He's gotten a handful of opportunities. he's somebody that is having just an absolute blast with this group and is so bought in and everything. So that's been an important piece of this as well, is that you don't have this feeling of like discontentment in the locker room from some of the guys that aren't on the court. So it's kind of everybody, but I would say it starts with Al and it kind of trickles down to everybody else.
I love it. I think the point about the 9 through 15 is sometimes like, and I compare the example to football where it's like people don't realize how important those practice squad or scout team, I think as they're called in a lot of different leagues, where like those guys are the ones every single day putting in work just as much as everyone else, where that buy-in and that culture, and that kind of speaks to a couple things I want to get into is like, there was some questions marks last year with the coaching staff, and Mazzulla being in the first year, right? It's always an adjustment period for somebody like that, right? And that's a really, really big part of how you build continuity is believing in your coaching staff. You see that a lot in college, of course, more than anything. I cover college enough that I've seen it where you could tell immediately whether you've been with the team that long or whether you've been with the team for this is your first game with them, right? You can tell immediately if guys really care about that staff and really care about what they believe in. So what do you feel like has changed from last year? I was going to get into like, is there a weakness that may be faltering the Celtics in the future? But we'll get into that in a minute. But is there something you spoke to there? Is there something that you see differently? I know obviously coming in, they brought in Charles Lee and Sam Cassell. I think that's obviously a huge thing. But is there something that you're seeing from Mazzulla maybe that is fueling what we see on the court right now?
Yeah, I mean, he's way more comfortable. He's way more confident. He had the whole summer to game plan and figure out what kind of schemes he wanted to implement, what the team's values and philosophies would be. He talks about that a lot. But more than that, I mean, he was a Brad Stevens assistant. That's where he came from. And then when Ime came in, Ime became the head coach, and he kept Mazzulla and he kept another assistant, Tony Dobbins. And that was because of recommendations from the front office and because the players themselves wanted those two to stay. And so Ime was in Boston on Saturday night, and he was just talking about this. So this is very fresh in my mind. But those two guys weren't his assistants. They weren't the guys that he brought on board. And then Mazzulla was chosen to replace him. And I think that left just an uncomfortable dynamic among the coaching staff, that now you have all of his assistants were actually another coach's assistants. And now he has to roll with it the whole season. And I don't think that there was any particular issues, but it wasn't like that was his coaching staff. So I think it was super under-discussed, undervalued how challenging it is to be a head coach in this league with a coaching staff that you didn't assemble, that aren't necessarily bought into you. I don't know this at all, and I don't want to overly speculate, but I'm sure there were guys in that bench that were thinking, why wasn't I the one that, I'm the first assistant head coach, second assistant, why was I not the one that was promoted to this position? There was a lot of weirdness around, Udoka's suspension and everything else around that. So the fact that this summer he was able to actually handpick who he wanted on this staff and figure out how he was going to allocate them. There's certain players that he's kind of matched up with certain coaches that are working one-on-one together. He's like been able to put together a system, and he didn't have that last year. He was kind of rolling with the punches, figuring it out. He's talked about how he kind of lost touch with some of the guys that were lower on the bench. So he felt like he kind of lost some of those individual relationships. And this year he's been really, really intent on furthering all those relationships. So it's just been night and day, honestly. Like, obviously there's something, he's a basketball mind, and that's why Brad Stevens elevated him to that role last year. But that's what he had going for him last year. He didn't have the system in place or the time or any of that. And so I think this year he has the buy-in, and you're seeing a completely different person. And just seeing him from a media standpoint, he's so comfortable. He's like, actually really funny. He's very, very entertaining on the podium. There's just this feeling about him that he knows this is his position and this is his job. And he's very he owns it. And in the past, that just wasn't the case. So night and day. And I think really it starts from the staff that he put together.
All of that stuff contributes to the play on the floor. But once the 4 or 5 guys are on the floor, it is, I laid out all the great things that are happening right now. Is there a weakness that you've seen? And it'll tie into something we talk about towards the end when it comes to what the season looks like moving forward. But is there something that you see is there a stretch or a thing that they're doing offensively or defensively where that could be an Achilles heel for them the rest of this year?
Something that's been a little bit concerning, and I don't have the latest numbers on this, but the third quarters have sometimes been pretty rough. At points, I think they were like one of the worst third quarter teams in the league, and then they went out west and had a pretty good road trip where that wasn't the case. Part of it is just they usually have a good halftime lead, so maybe they come out a little bit sleepy, whereas the other team comes out fired up, and so there's just that mental component. But that's something that will definitely continue to keep my eye on, because you don't want to see trends like that where every single game, they come out and blow a second half lead. That's not going to translate well to playoff success. The other piece is, maybe this is not really what you were getting at, but Porzingis' health is always a question mark. He's had a couple of like nicky knack things, nothing super substantial, but he's been such an important part of what they've been doing this year. And without him, you pretty much just have Al Horford and then guys that have never really played in the postseason, like Luke Kornet and Neemias Queta. And so that's something that everybody's kind of monitoring. Is he going to be able to stay on the court, stay active, engaged? And then the only other thing is just down the stretch, there have been some games that there's just been some stagnation on offense where this team is at their best when they run the floor, when they push the pace. Jaylen Brown has talked about that extensively. That's where he's at his best. But I think also just the whole roster is at their best when they are playing like that. And it's not unique to them, but they slow down in fourth quarters of close games, especially if they're up by 5 or 6 and they're trying to kind of burn as much clock as they can. And we've seen them get in trouble for that a couple of times this year, not nearly as much as past years, but I think until we see them, really thrive with late game execution in the playoffs, there's going to be questions about whether they've kind of defeated old habits. And with that, I think Porzingis is actually a huge piece of that late game execution. He's bailed them out a couple of times this year where down the stretch, it was like Derek White, Kristaps Porzingis pick and rolls, and he's hitting his free throws and, converting on alley-oops and just kind of like a cheat code, honestly. So his ability to stay on the court is going to be important for some of that late game offense, but I'm not really overly concerned about anything. I think they've been a pretty well-rounded team, both offensively and defensively.
No, I wasn't alluding to Porzingis necessarily, of course, because that's something that's going to get brought up ad nauseum. So I did notice 20th in assists per game. It does feel like that, you mentioned a little bit there about like some of the shot clock stuff and, where they are their best when they're moving and don't have to get into much of a set sometimes. But, when you have that many good guards, I think you just have to rely on them at that point. And, what Derek White and Drew Holiday bring you defensively, I think you're willing to live a little bit with, maybe not being the greatest passers in the world or the greatest generators of offense whenever you have two guys that in the playoffs we've seen for over 5 years now know how to get shots done in the playoffs, right? You've seen it in the finals. We saw it in many of those finals runs or Eastern Conference finals runs. All right, let's address the elephant in the room because I got a couple things I want to get to at the end that aren't necessarily geared towards what we've talked about so far. The elephant in the room being, of course, 19-0. I'm superstitious, so I feel even bad asking this or talking about this, but it is an elephant in the room. We have to address it, right? For those that don't know, Celtics are 19-0 at home. I went back and looked at some of the games at home that were close, and I will tell you, I went with close as 6-point game, as in 2 threes that could have completely changed, tied whatever the result of a late game. I didn't go in super detail about what the end of these games looked like, but just the result alone. There was a few 7-pointers in there, a few 10s, a few whatever, but 6 and less, that's where I'm like, okay, that was in jeopardy, right? So a couple that came to note: November 22nd against Milwaukee, 116-119 win. December 1st against Philly, 119-125 win. December 12th against Cleveland, a 7-point win. Cleveland was without Mobley in that one, so I thought that was interesting. That not that he is this offensive, punch here, but having him doesn't hurt their offense by any means. Of course, the one that we all remember in recent time, December 28th against Detroit, 122-128. That one was probably like the entire Garden was holding its breath. And then the Toronto one on December 29th, 118-120. So nice, to see to see a victory down the stretch there. And then Denver comes to town this Friday, the 19th, on ESPN, 2 days after this pod is supposed to be going up. So less of a question that's geared toward a straight answer here, but I guess at what point has it crossed your mind that it's a possibility that they could do this? Like they could run this stable at home. Obviously, we're a long way away from that, but like, has that even crossed your mind?
They're not going to go undefeated at home.
Of course, right? I mean, they've done it, right? 40-1? I don't have it in front of me. I've heard it a million times.
That was actually, this is their best ever start as an organization.
I did see that. I saw that part. I saw you correct. I think you corrected somebody, or I think you had posted that, and I was like, I knew that.
Yeah.
But there have been I think one of the 80s teams they were 40-1.
One of the 80s teams lost a game in the middle, and then I think they finished with like one loss at home.
Right. Okay.
But I will say, have you ever been to TD Garden before?
I have not. I have been to the other Garden for my first ever game about 3.5 years ago. I've been to Charlotte and I've been to Houston. Those are the 3 so far. I need to expand that out a little bit. But
so start with Boston because they've been asked this question a bunch. Like, well, how are you undefeated at home? they're not like they're undefeated at home, and then I think they're like maybe 11-9 on the road or something like that. So like almost a 500 team, which is pretty much the whole league right now, which is kind of interesting. But the home crowd has just been insane. Like it has actually been, I don't know. I think it's part of it is just the excitement around this team. They're very likable. They're very exciting. They're fun to watch. But the crowd has been unreal. And I think that there's a couple of those games that they absolutely would not have won if the crowd was not the way that it was. You didn't mention Minnesota, which was last week. That was an overtime game. I guess they ended up winning by more than 6, but that one was absolutely in jeopardy. That they were trailing by, I think, 7 with 3 minutes to go, and they kind of pulled that one off as well. So there's been a couple of games that were completely, very much in jeopardy. And I'm sure that eventually one of these games is going to be a loss. It's not like they've been blowing out every single team that comes in, although there have been a lot of blowouts at home. But this crowd has been unreal. And I always think it is pretty wild if you look at the standings. Like every single team's home record is so much better than their away record. And you think to yourself, like, you think that NBA teams would just figure this out and mentally just come in with the same mentality, the same attitude going to their away games. But clearly there's factors at play that are much larger than that. And so with this group, I do credit the crowd. I credit the connection that this team has with the crowd. Mazzulla mentioned, I think after the Timberwolves game, he said, there's been 2 times this year that I've shown that I have a pulse. And one of those times was tonight and another time was a couple weeks back, but they were both because of the crowd. And so that's what I would credit it to. I don't think this team is going to, they were pretty bad in the playoffs at home last year. So that was another thing that, Jason Tatum has talked about, is that they like kind of went into the summer thinking like we were pretty bad at home in the playoffs. And like, that sucks. That's not something you want to carry forward. And so that's probably another part of why they really made sure to be good this year, is to not, to be able to kind of reward their fans for coming and to capitalize on this advantage that they have over, I would say, probably almost every team in the league as far as having a really, really incredible home environment.
Look, I wasn't looking for some outlandish answer there around but look, I'm not in the building every night. I'm not the one sitting there feeling the atmosphere and understanding that does play a big part into it. I think it also speaks to this overarching thought that like professional sports outside of the NFL, it feels like the, night to night, even like the bad teams, like there are some good home environments in the NBA. Yeah. Like even when the Kings weren't like, for the last 15 years of our lives, when the Kings weren't good, they were still like Golden One Center or whatever it was called before was still an environment. It was still a place that, and I think League Pass is kind of fun because you could see that stuff, right? Yeah. You actually, if you don't click off in the multi-box, like you don't have to watch commercials. So you get to watch all the fun, festivities between timeouts and stuff. So I think that it is important. And now that you say it, I'm sitting here looking at the road records. I didn't really pay attention to that. Like I know that they were all pretty. There's not the most wins on the road, if I'm looking at it correctly. Phoenix or New York has the most road wins in the East, and a couple of teams in the West, Minnesota, New Orleans, and that's it in the West. Nobody has more than 12, and then there's not. Like, they're all basically 500. Let's just say within 2 to 3. I didn't even notice that. So I guess that does, I don't know. I maybe you don't have a great answer for how that's turning out so far, but I think you made a great point about what this team at least has bought into around the Garden. When those fans have always been rabid, let's be real. It's always been an environment that they care about. All right. So, realistically, Denver's probably going to be one circled on the calendar for everybody to watch, or for Denver's probably circling it like, hey, we can take this streak down or whatever, right? I'm not going to get through. I don't want to go through all the ones of like, oh, this could be the one or that could be the one, right? It's hard. Yeah. This team, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. So let's get into a couple of things that I think are good for the way I like to think about the NBA overarching, looking into the playoffs a little bit. Who in the East has the best chance to beat Boston in the playoffs? Is it Philadelphia or Milwaukee, or is there an answer outside of those two that I'm not thinking about?
I have to say Miami. I don't care that their roster isn't as star-studded. I mean, they've eliminated Boston 2 out of the last 3 years, and half of the fan base still acts like Milwaukee is not a threat. And I think there's just clearly a system in place and a schematic ability that Eric Spoelstra has that I think they should always be in the mix until proven otherwise. And so I always think like this is one of I have this qualm with like media and the media coverage is that every year everybody acts like Milwaukee's going to be bad. I mean, Miami's going to be bad. So from like a personal standpoint, I think that that's probably the number one threat, especially you have guys like Jaime Jaquez that has been just like really incredible surprises for this group. And then they just haven't been healthy either. So if like they are all healthy going into the playoffs, like you have Jimmy Butler, Tyler Hero. Jimmy Butler hasn't played all year, so he's going to be fresh, like stuff like that. I just think they're just a tough matchup regardless of when and who's on that team. And then outside of that, I would probably say the Bucks are the next biggest threat, just because, I mean, we all saw Damian Lillard last night. Like, they haven't had a guy like him in the past, and yeah. And it's just, yeah, you have Giannis, who's obviously a tough matchup, but then you also have a guy who's just a closer, and he's bailed them out of like 10 games this year that they probably shouldn't have won. That just down the stretch he took over, so they're going to be tough. And then the Sixers, I do think we're a little overconfident as a Celtics, group. As every year the Sixers are, they're easy to defeat, all that. I mean, the Celtics were a couple of Jason Tatum fourth quarter threes away last year in Game 6 from losing in Game 6 in the conference semifinals. So let's not act like the Celtics have been, sweeping the Sixers every year. So I think they're all real threats. These are really good NBA teams. And so I've seen a lot of pundits be like, oh, it's automatic, like Celtics going to the finals. Like it's really hard to get to the finals, and it's going to take some battles and probably a couple of 7-game series. So I view them all as real threats, but I would choose Miami just because of seeing them 2 out of the last 3 years. In the the one year that they did win, it was a Game 7 road win down the stretch, right? So could have been 3 for 3 if a couple of things had gone differently.
It's a great point, because the team, assuming everybody gets healthy, say they all, are ready to go, they've added Hawkes, right? Like they've added things where it feels like around the margins. I know Vincent's out, Strus is out to other places, but it just feels like they just find a way. They don't care if
Duncan Robinson's really good this year too.
Of course, yeah, resurgence, I would call it. Yeah, that's the thing about Miami. I didn't put them down because I didn't think right this second, at least because of Butler's injuries, that was a plausible answer. But I guess we are looking forward, and that is the way I ask it. So I like that you spun that on me, which was good, because I think my answer right now would be Philadelphia, just because I think they've, like, I've seen enough of both teams where I'm like, you're going to let Embiid do whatever he's going to do, right? 30-10 is what he's pushing for in the
Not if Al
right
Horford's playing, though.
Yeah,
I have a lot of faith in that until I see a playoff series where Al's not, like, I don't think Al's lost as much of a step as people think. So that's where my confidence comes from, at least. Like, you trade Al Horford, and I think we're talking about a different game. We have a secret weapon over here.
Do you think that actually happens? I mean, like, does it feel like you think Al Horford's being? I'm talking about Al Horford being traded. Do you think that actually happens?
Oh. No, I don't think he gets traded.
Okay. It seems like I can see, like, Thunder fans are already, like, putting him on lists of, like, oh, this would be a cool opportunity again for him. And it's like, so you don't think that happens?
I would be stunned if that happened. I mean, I also didn't see Marcus Smart get traded, so maybe I'm not the best trade predictor, but I think Al, the way that they talk about him, I mean, literally every single post game is like every single person going down the line talking about how he means everything to them and how he's the key to this team. And so if all of a sudden they shipped him out in favor of someone was saying Isaiah Stewart in favor of Al Horford, like I saw a trade proposed like that. It's like that would be terrible. So I think they keep him for the playoffs. They keep him for the locker room. They keep him because he's a really good basketball player still, who hasn't really shown as much decline as people might think. So yeah, I don't think he's going anywhere.
They have the ability to make moves around the margins without getting rid of a guy of that magnitude, unless it's getting you somebody you think is going to get you the title. Like, that's really, I agree with you. All right, last couple things here. Who in the West, assuming the Celtics make the finals in this scenario, of course, right? Who in the West would be the most difficult in a 6-game series, 7-game series? It goes late, right? Who in the West, stylistically, what you've seen, however you want to frame the answer, who would be the hardest matchup for the Celtics to push them to the brink against the title?
I think Denver. There's a couple of good teams there, obviously, and we've seen like teams like OKC and the Timberwolves, beat the Celtics already this year. But Denver at full strength with playoff Jamal Murray and Jokic playing the way that he's been playing for the last couple of years, it's just a formidable opponent. So I don't think the Celtics match up poorly, and I think there's it's actually they're probably one of the best matchups for Denver as far as like favorability for the opponent. But yeah, I think I would probably have to say them still. I'm just thinking about who else might even be up there. It's weird because going into the season, some of the teams that I was thinking about matching up with the Celtics are just not even in the mix right now, like the Lakers and the Suns.
Yep, that's what we were on the same page about. And
right, that's what when all the trades happened, I was thinking like, okay, how are they going to match up? So, and I just don't know if I see OKC yet going into the finals or being. I mean, I think OKC is dangerous just because I haven't seen a guard like SGA be so unstoppable in a while now. So just watching him burn through Drew Holiday and Derek White was like pretty shocking. So I guess if they faced SGA in the finals, that would be intimidating in its own right. But just the youth of that group makes me think the Celtics' experience would just outweigh that. So I would go with Denver, but shout out to SGA for making defenders look like regular people that are actually all NBA defenders.
That's a really great way to put that. Minnesota's interesting without diving super deep into it. Like just the ability to have three bigs that they can completely rely on and throw at people, no matter who you're playing against. Obviously, with the Celtics, it'd be Horford and some others there. But Minnesota, there's some shooting concerns for me. Obviously, Edwards hasn't been in that moment before. Like, there's a couple of things where I can pick and choose, an argument. If I was on like first take, I'd be like, well, this is the reason, right? But Minnesota obviously undoubtedly has been incredible, 28-11, number one in the West. They lead the Thunder by half a game. So I think all great candidates there. But I mean, at the end of the day, when Nikola Jokic, who's now been in the finals, won the finals, we know what he can be at the highest level on this stage. Like you just have to, that has to be the answer. And I knew that was probably your answer, which is why I was just bringing up the Minnesota point. All right. On the way out here, to ask for 30 minutes, I appreciate the opportunity here. So bucket list interview or piece about the Celtics or otherwise, is there somebody that you just, are just itching to have, whether it's a sit down piece about or a podcast or whatever? I saw Jaron Soldier's piece you wrote a couple months or weeks ago now. I think it would have been early December. Is there anybody that you're like, that would be the one? That would be awesome.
Isaiah Thomas.
Really? I like that. This is
cool. And it's funny because you say that, you bring up the Jared Sullinger piece, because Isaiah Thomas quote tweeted that, because in that article, so Sullinger named him his favorite ever teammate. And so I was pretty shameless. Because his DMs are off on Twitter. So I just quote tweeted him, and I just said, I'd love to interview him. A lot of my followers tagged him, but he didn't respond. So maybe one day. I think just because as a Celtic fan, also I was in high school when he kind of took over. And so that was kind of like prime of me, idolizing and just like loving the game of basketball and kind of everything that he brought to the table. I would love to sit down and talk to him. And also because he hasn't really done, he's like very active online. So everybody kind of knows what he's up to. He tweets a lot, but he hasn't done like a real sit down in a long time where he can kind of share his story and perspective and reflection. So it would be awesome to do that. So he'd probably be my top choice. Yeah, for sure. Actually.
That's you were confident in from the start, so I mean, land the plane with that. That's he's so interesting. Like you mentioned, the online part of it. Like, I mean, at this point, just offer up the ability to be like, hey, this is be a platform for you to find a team. Like, I mean, however you got to do it. Isaiah Thomas, if you're listening, there's your opportunity. So he's definitely active. Like I know that's. It's so funny. It's like every time a guard like does something or goes down or whatever, or there's a roster spot, he's just like, I'm ready, I'm here, and I'm like. I don't know. I've never seen a guy pull that off in today's NBA. All right. Refresh people where they can find your work. Everything will be linked in the description below. Everything that you sent to me or whatever I mentioned at the top. Refresh people's minds. Anything you might be working on. Stuff coming up. Obviously, the All-Star breaks basically a month from today, roughly. And so, let people know if there's anything that they can be reading.
Yeah. So again, Noa Dalzell NBA on Twitter or X is the best place to find me. I share all my articles. You can also find my author link there with all of my articles. And then I'm working on a couple of things. I'm actually trying to do a little bit more coverage on some of the G League guys that are on the Celtics. So I've been going to some main games, going to continue to do that. Working on a piece on Jordan Walsh, their draft pick from this year, and then JD Davison from last year. So if you're interested in kind of player development or what's happening with the guys that aren't getting as much limelight, I'll be having some stories come out about those guys soon. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Awesome. Thank you again for the time. Look forward to talking to you again.